So don't worry, this talk is actually not going to be at all about AI security. It's really going to be predominantly about pirates. Yep. And I just want to say, before we get started, I have to get this off my chest. This is the same movie theater where I saw Dark Knight 16 years ago, so this is very trippy for me. But with that, further ado, let's talk about pirates. So first, by way of introduction, how did I come up with this topic? I noticed during my time at Google and before, but especially working with SREs and looking at how security teams were adopting some SRE practices, that there was this remarkable similarity to what I'd read about 18th century pirates. And I'm really specifically focused on 18th century Atlantic pirates, right? The ones in the Caribbean and in the southern, what is today the southern United States, and in Western Africa. These pirates are very different from just about any other of the many, many hundreds that existed throughout history. And there's some unique things about them, about their time and place, that I think led to some of the operational practices that we're going to look at today. But before I get into that, I do have to do a little bit of demystifying, because a lot of what we think about pirates comes from probably one of these, and from video games and popular culture. And they're fun, right? They drink, they steal stuff, it's cool. It happened 300 years ago, so, long enough ago that it's safe to enjoy that. But still, there's something about pirates that draws us, the sense of freedom that they have, and the sense of kind of being out in this frontier and not having to worry about the rules anymore, that just kind of maintains their cultural relevance throughout the generations, right? And some of that is true, but I want to demystify some of, I think, the negative aspects that they're portrayed as having, so that we can really see kind of what makes them tick, how they work, what's special about them. So before I get started, though, at least in the time period I'm talking about, which is about 1690 to 1725, the Golden Age of Piracy, there's more or less peace between the major empires, right? The British and the Spanish had their big wars, and now, things have settled. But you also have this group of people that have this unique, exceptional technical skill. If you think about ships back then, this was the cutting edge technology. These things are just incredibly complex compared to really most other things in the world at the time. And a very small percentage of the population knew how to use them, right? So there's a broader sailor culture that pirates are taking from here. And you may see some analogies today to people working in technology, and specifically in some of the emerging technologies. Likewise, so there's this representation in movies and video games that pirates are incredibly violent, right? They get into a lot of pirate battles. That certainly did happen, but typically they were not using violence to accomplish their aims. Instead, they're using psychological intimidation, right? And if you even look at one of the most famous pirates, Blackbeard, what he's known for is really his special ways of intimidating the target that he's going after, right? So what about this is interesting? That they have to maintain this reputation, and we'll look at some of the ways that they do that. But another interesting point is that sailors chose to join pirate crews, right? They weren't kind of forced to do this. And they overwhelmingly chose to become pirates as opposed to staying on a merchant vessel or staying on a military ship if they had a choice. Even if they left a life of piracy, they would often say, those were the best years of my life. If you want freedom, being a pirate is the way to do it. So the people who participated in this overwhelmingly seem to like it. That's pretty interesting too. Big misconception about pirate captains. Now, there's a reason for this, right? Pirates did not keep very good logs. People are typically not going to take notes on a criminal conspiracy. But pirate captains, so logging and the way pirates did it, not something for us to learn from. But pirate captains were not people who owned a ship, right? The way that a captain of a merchant vessel was. They were not some higher social class, that made 100 times as much as the crew. They were typically of the crew, right? They were really integrated, and we're going to see some examples of that I think are interesting. But because of that, because they were part of the crew, if the crew didn't like a captain on a pirate ship, it was far less likely to be a bloody mutiny the way it would be on a merchant ship. So I think that's one really important difference. And then finally, yeah, I mean, with one exception, I think I mentioned, they didn't own the ships. There's one exception, Stede Bonnet. He actually bought a pirate ship, and he's kind of a goofy pirate for a lot of other reasons. But they didn't own the ships. The crew owned it, right? So this is another kind of interesting difference. So with that out of the way, I think I've done about 2 books worth in, I don't know, about 5 minutes. So let's get into pirate culture, right? Because this is really the root to a lot of what I want to talk about. So one concept of a good work culture is that it's inspiring, not mandated. Right? You can't really force people to have a culture the way that you can force them to follow certain policies. Culture is something else. It's emergent. People volunteer to do it. And so if you're going to design one or change one, it's got to be in a way that draws people in, not in a way that you force them to behave a certain way. And pirate culture is a great example of this, right? There was no real ideology with pirates. It just happened. So how did it happen? Well, one is that pirates, as sailors, understood the risks inherent to operating a ship, right? There are a million ways that you could get injured, that you could get sick in a battle, that you could die. So there's all these different risks to being a sailor and engaging in, conflicts in general. Pirates are aware of these. But because they're voluntarily coming together to form this unit, to form a ship and a crew, and they're the ones choosing to do it, right? It's not being forced on them by a state or a company. It's something that they're willingly doing. They acknowledge this risk together, and they're able to plan ahead for these risks together. And if you look at how ships are organized, right, what kind of keeps them together? What are the articles of faith? They have something called, closer to the microphone. All right. They have something called the Articles, which is kind of the constitution of the ship. And it outlines everything from why are we operating together to if you get injured, if there's an incident, if we lose all of our money, if someone loses a leg, what is the reimbursement going to be? Who's going to pay for it? So pirates think about this in advance, and just about any other type of ship really didn't care what happened to most of the people on the crew. There was none of this advanced risk planning. So on a merchant ship, what would happen? Well, if a sailor were to get sick or disabled, they would just very often be abandoned, right? And whereas on pirate ships, so one part of the popular conception that is accurate is that people who lost a leg or a hand would still stay on the crew, right? So you have people who are not doing as much as they did before, but they're still considered an important part of the crew. And that's kind of an interesting aspect of what they maintained, right? So what I want to get to is a crew still has a sense of shared fate, right? It's not as if you have this absolute freedom where you don't care about consequences anymore. So you still have an aversion to failure, right? There's still the possibility of a ship sinking, but failure that is outside of your control is safer. There's more assurance that there's going to be support in spite of failure. And you did not have this on a merchant vessel. Now, what this maps to, and what we see in site reliability engineering and in kind of security teams that are trying to adopt some of those practices, also from DevOps, DORA, these types of new ways of thinking about organization, boils down to Westrom's 3 different cultures: generative, bureaucratic, and pathological. So in a pathological culture that's power-oriented, where people are kind of driven by fear, and where there's a tendency for people, as a result of not trusting each other, to kind of blame each other when things go wrong. Really, this is the type of ship philosophy, if you will, that pirates are trying to get away from, right? When they leave a merchant ship or a military ship, it's to get away from this. This is the antithesis of their freedom. And then, in the middle, there's the bureaucratic one, which if you heard the talk just before this one, it was a great talk. But there is a description of larger organizations typically having all these rules and siloing. And this is a hard problem to get out of, because people will go to the lower accountability, it's not my job, when there's a lack of mission, right? It's easy to say, that's not my job, that's some other department, when no one really cares about the organization's central mission, right? When you're only focused on a specific department. But then on a smaller scale, like the scale of a pirate ship, where you've got an intimate crew, they all know each other, at a max, we're talking 300 people, right? And typically much smaller. And there, it's very performance-oriented, right? Of course, if they fail, typically didn't end well for pirates. But that threat is external, right? Internally, there's good information flow, there's high levels of collaboration. They're all willingly there. So the generative model is really exemplified in how pirates operated their ships, as opposed to, to the merchant and military ships. And there are some, definite kind of benefits to doing this in an organization today. So this is from Dora's 2023 research, so you can get that report online. But in terms of, there's three things I want to point out here: generative culture, flexibility, and work distribution. You'll notice that there's not just gains to job satisfaction, right? You don't just want to be a part of this crew. There's also gains to productivity, right? You have generally an easier time of shipping things, shipping them well. So that is to say, this isn't just about kind of an ideology of the best work culture. There's also direct benefits to this in terms of what it is that you're producing. So with that in mind, I want to look a little bit more at, okay, with this culture, with this generative culture in mind, how did that affect kind of day-to-day operations on a pirate ship and the way that pirates looked at toil and redundancy? And before I jump into that, I want to quickly just kind of clarify what I mean by toil in the SRE sense, as opposed to, what the term kind of might mean in everyday conversation. So in everyday conversation, toil is that stuff that we don't really want to do, right? It's boring. But in the sense that I mean, there are some types of work that you have to do no matter what, like, doing a weekly report or just kind of capturing the work that you've done over a month. That's overhead, right? That is work that is just meant to kind of help with the administrative flow of things. Likewise, there are some types of toil that are actually enjoyable, right? So toil is repetitive, manual work that you can kind of predict ahead of time. And the notion that people don't like toil is often incorrect. And because of that, toil has this way of sticking around in the way that a team works. So doing manual operations for some people is very fun. They like getting their hands on the keyboard. They like directly administering things, right? Manually analyzing logs, et cetera. But really, toil hurts an organization above all, right? Because it's repetitive, it's not efficient. And that's the key way to think about this, right? So let's look at a pirate ship and how it's different. So pirate ships typically are small. They are not these huge galleons that you see in the movies. There were one or two examples of that, but for the most part, we're talking medium-sized frigates. But they had an overabundance of crew, right? They had far more crew than a typical ship, and there's a good reason for this. One is that a typical ship has a specific time-bound mission, right? We're going to leave from this port in Europe, go to the Caribbean, pick some things up, go back home. And so the more people we have aboard, the more that costs. And so it is ultimately in our interests for our margins to have a really small crew. There's a pirate ship, completely opposite mission, right? Their mission is to intercept ships in a very small range. And to do that, as I mentioned earlier, they're really relying more on psychological intimidation. There's 10 of us for every one of you. So you don't have to fight, just give up. So because of that, it benefited them to have these large crews. And they were able to sustain these large crews, right? They're not taking these huge voyages typically. Another thing is that they're using redundancy as a strategy, right? They don't want the crew to get tired or sick or injured. So they actually have very small work shifts with all these extra people on the ship. What is usually an 8 or 10 hour day for a person on a merchant vessel is maybe 4 hours on a pirate ship, right? So they're able to reduce the amount of work per person, which means people are happier, they're ready to board an enemy vessel, right? They typically are able to kind of keep their spirits up for a longer time. So what can we learn from this, right? I'm not suggesting that everyone should just kind of slack off and not really work hard, but in terms of having Slack as a feature in the system, there are some other ways that we can think about this, and the one that comes to mind the most is automation, right? And focusing much more on being able to automate and spending people's time automating than spending people's time manually doing work. Right, that's kind of the overall view. Now, the SRE take on this is that manual operations, any manual operation should be viewed as a bug. Oh, you had to do that to fix that problem yourself? Okay, that's a bug. We want to find a way to make it so that if this thing happens again, you don't have to go through those steps. And so the excess capacity to do that type of thinking, planning, project work is a feature. It's no longer the case that, this security team or the operations team, they're just sitting around. They have nothing to do. They have no tickets. Quite the contrary. They're spending their time thinking in advance. Oh, if we have this type of situation come up again, what's the best way to approach it? If we can anticipate certain risks, how do we take that on in advance instead of just waiting for them to happen, right? And so work primarily turns into project work and reduction of toil, and not this kind of standardized IT ticket work where you're just fixing things that are broken. So then, if you have these other two components that I mentioned, right, you have a culture where failures that are out of your control are typically safe, a crew trusts each other, right, there's this sense of a shared mission, and also you have this desire to reduce toil and to find ways to scale out and prepare in advance for incidents as opposed to just reacting all the time. What does leadership look like in this kind of setup on a pirate ship? So a good way to talk about this is to just look at how pirates structurally organize their ships, right? So if you look at a typical ship, you can probably tell I used to be a grade school teacher by my artistic abilities. But the captain's quarters took up this prominent place on the deck, right? It was convenient for the captain. They had a nice view. Took up a lot of space. But remember what I said that was so different about pirate ships, that the captain doesn't own the ship. They're a member of the crew. On a pirate ship, they would turn the captain's quarters of a captured vessel into extra storage space. Or they would just get rid of it altogether to have more room to operate. And the captain, in both cases, would sleep in the lower decks with the rest of the crew. So how do you think of a security leader in this particular kind of framing? Well, one thing I'd point out is that in SRE, there's a concept of an incident commander that we adopted from 1960s emergency response, which is a person of a team. This person does not have a permanent leadership position, but whenever there's an incident, if they're the specialist, if they're the one who knows the most about this type of incident, they temporarily take kind of the central role. And it's really a role to help communicate and coordinate and help all these other teams figure out what the other team is doing, right? It's for information flow, primarily. Occasionally it's for decision making, but again, you're picking someone qualified in this specific area to do the decision making. And then once the incident starts to die down and things start to return to normal, that person reintegrates into the crew. And so this is very different from having permanent leadership that is assigned to these posts. Now, out of this, we started to wonder, right? We being SRE, DORA, is professional management an anti-pattern, right? Is having a permanent position something that can actually work against an organization over time, especially if you get out of touch with how individual contributors are doing things, especially if you're not the specialist. And what I'd say is it's actually, especially given most of the people in this room probably work for companies or the government or an organization with some sort of external stakeholder, we actually still do need, professional managers. We need some way to respond to those stakeholders. But this idea that leadership is a status as opposed to a function, I think the way that pirate captains worked is an interesting kind of counterexample to the notion of leadership as a status. And so if you take a pirate captain as an exemplar, right, for leadership, it's more desirable for the crew. But like I said also, in our research, in Dora and in other cases where you have a leader who only steps in when that's their specialty, we see lower recidivism of incidents of that type, right? We see an awareness of kind of the problem specific to their skill set. So how successful ultimately were these pirates, right? If we're saying what we can learn from them, we should see how effective they were. And obviously they don't exist anymore. And they were really only around for about 35 years at their peak. So like what happened? What are the boundaries here? Well, it did take the imperial powers 35 years to respond to the threat of Atlantic pirates, right? For 35 years, they basically didn't face that much resistance. And we can see in the numbers, in 1690, there were only 2 British Imperial Navy ships that were permanently patrolling the Caribbean. But by 1725, there are 24, right? So clearly, over time, this grew into enough of a problem to warrant a response. Some other limitations, right? Piracy is inherently parasitic. It doesn't produce anything. It's just kind of depending on the rest of the economy working, and it takes from that. But in general, if you're a cost center that doesn't, primarily produce profit in a company, whatever that might be, you have to think, how do I fit into the broader economy, right? And pirates did find a way to do so positively, right? They found a way to be tolerated by the local population by selling things to them, by minding their manners a bit more with locals. So there is a way that pirates still were able to integrate, and in fact, they were an important part of this local economy. And finally, one thing about pirates over time is that people, realized that the risk was really great in doing it, but they were able to reintegrate into the rest of society, right? So a lot of pirates did not end up, dying or captured. They became parts of society again. And I point out that the Golden Age of Piracy ends in 1725. But what happens 50 years later, right? It's, part of what made this country possible, right? And you actually have something very similar going on, both in this pirate culture and in the colonies, where people realize, hey, we're pretty far away from the central imperial power. We're good at doing things on our own. And we just have a smarter, fairer way of doing things. Why don't we just abandon the old way and commit to this? So I think that's an interesting take home, especially if you're starting a new team or going to a new team or kind of have this fresh space to work with, that maybe inheriting those older ways of doing things may not be the best way, right? So as a concept, piracy, we still use the term in non-literal cases too. But the legacy that I think a lot of us take on from it today, right? It's on the swag that you'll see in the expo hall. It's in some of the other conferences we go to, right? Why does this stick around? One thing that I want you to just remember and think about is that these are technical people who are escaping from a bad, older way of doing things and trying to create something that's more desirable, more practical, more open, right? And so with that, thank you for listening. We have about 5 minutes for questions and comments, but I could certainly love to, Sure. So I can't really see anyone, but yeah.
There are no questions in Slido yet, so either you can shout out your question or put it in Slido.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, I don't know enough about blockchain to, sure.
I'm just generally wondering what other technologies this applies to. So blockchain comes to mind as you're talking.
Sure, yeah. mean, it really applies to anywhere the people doing the manual operations today could potentially do the automation in the future. So from the tech standpoint, I think that's the key one.
I really like the interesting concept with professional managers. Do you ever see a team composition where there's no managers, but as you said, there's concept of incident commanders rising up and reintegrating into the team and rising up, and do you see that practicable?
Absolutely. And so the point about professional managers too, I've actually discussed this exact topic predominantly with professional managers, right? And they've come to a point of realization that, that especially on highly technical teams, being able to entrust a member of the team with incidents is one of the best ways to ensure career growth, maintain cohesion, but also get the best person for the job. And so preparing for that in advance is a part of their role. Again, I mentioned that you still need professional managers for other things, right? HR related, fiduciary responsibility, etc. Representing the team to the broader organization, right? But in terms of the incident component, absolutely, you can have these two coexist, right?
Where do you see new teams best form this kind of culture, but still fit into like a broader organization that maybe operates a little bit more old school?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So some of the other areas that I didn't talk about so much. So sorry, I'm gonna take another sip of water. Some things I didn't talk about as much are iterative approaches to change, right? And funny enough, pirates offer another good example. If you look at those very rare logs that I mentioned, you'll notice that merchant ships have a very specific port they're traveling to and from, right? And they plan this months in advance. So this is kind of the old waterfall approach, if you will. Whereas a pirate ship, if you look at its trajectory, it bounces around all over the place, right? Pirates are looking for a safe port. The crew is voting on where to go next. It's kind of chaotic, but it works for them. And the key with any of this, with SRE, DORA, anything, is small iterative steps. So in a large organization, the biggest challenge is how do you earn the trust of the larger org and the leadership there to do this experimenting? One way that I've seen this very clearly is with teams that are especially trying to go through a DevSecOps type transformation or trying to shift security left, so to speak. They very often have leadership that expects that adding security left is not going to create any friction at all, or it's just going to magically improve things. So the biggest way for them to succeed is to say, manage those expectations, right? If we're adding all of this vulnerability scanning earlier, if we're doing SCA and SAST, all of a sudden, abruptly, with no configuration whatsoever, we're going to have false positives through the roof. We're going to have developers who don't know how to do the analysis. We're going to have security teams that are overburdened and can't do, the false positive bit. So the time that it will take to get to a point where we start to benefit is going to be much, much further past this point. But prepping the larger organizational leadership for that experimentation, that's probably the most important part. And saying, look, we're going to be taking small steps, failing fast, but that's what this team needs in order to try this out, right?
There's a question in the back. Can you shout out your question? Yeah.
I'm wondering if the merchant ships, they have to adapt to present pirates. So the question is, are there any correlations to security from that angle?
Oh, cool, yeah.
Can you repeat the question for
Absolutely, yeah. So the question was, merchant ships also had to respond to the threat of pirates, right? And so given that we're talking about security, typically we may see ourselves as the one fighting against the pirates in some respects. So merchant ships typically insured their cargo, right? And so I wanted to avoid this, but now I'm going to say that getting insurance is a solution to this problem. But really, what happened over time was that merchants started to see that piracy is inevitable, and that the cost of protecting a ship is actually not worth what the loss would be, given how rare some of these incidents were and how disparate the pirate groups were. So there was some risk calculation, but ultimately, I would say the other take-home is that the merchants kept going back to the imperial powers and saying, we need the Navy here. This is not something that we can handle on our own. It's getting too expensive for us. Ultimately, it's going to affect the economy if we don't stop this. So I think industry-wide, kind of enlisting government and working a little bit more with the people who are really tasked with preventing this would be the step that we need to take, right? Individual organizations shouldn't be thinking of themselves as like single-handedly fighting against these threats.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Aaron, for...
I will be walking around for the next 2 hours or so happy to chat with you up there. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much, Aaron.